All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to start with our last three expert presenters that were chosen by the steering committee today. The more sort of background experts before the panel selects its own slate of experts and stakeholders for next week. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex to introduce that.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Hello, everybody. So we have three presenters for you all today. Very exciting. And I think everybody should be fairly comfortable with this format now. So each presenter will be given 10 minutes. And then after all three have done their presentations, we'll come back to the big group. Well, we'll stay in the big group and we'll open it up for questions. So we'll have a little bit longer for this section today, but each presenter will have the same amount of time as on Tuesday and Thursday. And just one more reminder, we're still in kind of the background, kind of just getting a sense for the issue and the context. So we're still going to be focusing on clarifying questions when we move into the Q&A section. So I want to bring up our first presenter, who is Chris Pryor. Chris Pryor is a Eugene City Councilor for Ward 8, serving since 2017. And Chris, I'll let you do kind of anything else you want to introduce about yourself to the panel. Thanks for being here.
Great, thank you for inviting me. And I am not here as a technical person because I'm not a planner. I'm not a person who works in terms of the functions of housing. I'm here as a policymaker, the person who has to try to figure out how to balance the competing interests and figure out how to actually implement and create the local level response to housing. And so I don't have a slideshow. Really what I want to talk about is actually something that Lynn mentioned right at the very beginning of the meeting, which is how do you strike a balance between all of the different interests. And one of the things that I've noticed a lot about housing over the years is that there is a factual side to the conversation about housing, but then there is also what I like to call the articles of faith, what people just believe about housing, whether they have facts to back that or not. And as an elected official, having to represent the community, one of the things I'm always trying to balance is what facts we have about housing and what people want to believe about housing and how those actually can come into conflict. Because when we have to make decisions as a city council, it is oftentimes between competing values or interests that have a certain level of validity. It's not between this is right and this is wrong. It's this is right, but this is also right. And I have to find one or the other to choose. And so it puts you in a very difficult position to have to be able to say, I'm choosing this because I think this is the best choice overall. And the people who say, but my choice was valid, why didn't you choose that, become upset. Part of my role on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, which was a statewide advisory committee to say, we're going to come up with the rules, but we need your advice on what those rules should look like from a statewide perspective. And there were 2 large city elected representatives and 2 small city elected representatives. One was the primary, one was the alternate. So of this entire rulemaking committee, there were really 2 policymakers that were on the group. And we were not there to be the people who helped work through the technical issues. We were the people that were saying, this is what's likely going to happen at the local level when you try to implement this with the elected officials. It's our role to take your rules and implement them and do it in a way that reflects what we believe our community values or at least believes to be true. And why that needed to be unbiased was if I come in with a predisposition about what I think housing should be, I'm no longer representing my community. I'm now representing my own personal opinion. And while my own personal opinion is a factor in interpreting those choices, I still have to be able to reflect that. And that was a very difficult position to be in because I would hear advocates for affordable housing say, we need to do this and we need to do this. And then I would hear people who, and there were folks from planning departments, people like Sophie and others who were there saying, but we have to actually implement this. It's not that we're against House Bill 2001, but we recognize that in order to implement it, there's certain things you have to do, and we may not have the time, we may not have the resources, we may not have the support of our elected officials to do it. So let's find that appropriate balance. For me, the challenge is, and has always been, that affordable housing, at least in my community, has always been a whack-a-mole challenge. And any of you who have played whack-a-mole know that you whack the mole down in one hole and it simply pops up in another. And that's always been the issue for us here in Eugene. We have the people who want to whack down the mole of density, and it will simply pop up in terms of expansion, grow up or grow out. And there are some people whose article of faith is that everybody wants to live in a big single family home on a large lot. They absolutely believe that. And their entire neighborhoods advocate for that. And they will come out in strength to advocate for that. On the other hand, you have people who whack down the mole of expansion who say we cannot expand one single acre beyond where we are now. If you want to accommodate growth, you have to do it by adding more and more density. And so, facts aside, you have people who believe firmly in the large single family home on a large lot, and those who believe you cannot expand without creating more density. And so the facts may not agree with that, either one of those positions. And at the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, they were wrestling with the specific rules that were going to govern how we provided more affordable housing. And we had to be able to say, I need clarity and I need certainty in how those rules will be applied. One of the things we've discovered locally is that if you are unclear in the rules that you make, it is very easy for a local jurisdiction to say, oh, I don't understand what that rule means, therefore I don't have to implement it. And so one of the things we were watching very carefully in the rulemaking process was you need to be as clear and as consistent as possible in the rules you make. The counterbalance to that is the more clear and the more precise you make the rules, the less flexibility you have. And one of my roles as an elected official is to try to maintain as much flexibility as I can, to say this neighborhood and this neighborhood are different. And if you try to imply a one-size-fits-all ruling to these two neighborhoods, your outcome will be different. And so that became part of my role, was to say, from a policy standpoint, if I impose a very rigid, clear, but rigid restriction, then I may get a good outcome in this neighborhood and a bad outcome in that neighborhood. So how can I figure out a way to balance that? And that became the challenge for me, was to say, I believe in what 2001 is trying to do. Maybe that was why I was picked. I believe in what 2001 is trying to do. And I want to make sure that as we do it, we're clear, but we're also flexible. And so probably the point I want to make is, how do you make rulemaking something that can be very clear, but also flexible? And I think they really worked to try to do that. And so when you look through all the technical aspects of the rulemaking process, the underlying theme I was looking for is, can we be clear, but can we also offer a certain level of flexibility? And so I'll stop there in case anyone has any questions. I'm probably pretty close to my time anyway.
So that's great. Thank you. We're actually going to hold questions until the very end, if that works for you. Perfect. Thank you so much. And so we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is Sarah Adams-Schoen, a University of Oregon School of Law assistant professor. And I'll give you the floor, Sarah, to kind of do any other introductions that you feel the panel should know about you.
Sure. So thank you for having me here. It's really an honor. And I'm impressed with this program. I'm also just really impressed with the citizens who are showing up and taking, I was thinking of my showing up here today as this little sacrifice, because it's a Saturday morning, and yet I'm only presenting for 10 minutes, and thinking about the citizens who are showing up for each day of this program is really just really restores and renews my faith, in our local democracy. But here I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. And here we go. So, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about residential zoning, and in particular, low density single family residential zoning, which makes up really the vast majority of the land area in cities throughout Oregon and throughout the United States. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk, briefly about the really kind of ugly history of zoning, and in particular residential zoning in the American law of zoning, which was an explicitly racially segregationist history. And then I'm going to bring it forward to more the modern law of zoning, and talk a little bit about just this basic concept under zoning of compatible land uses, and what that has meant for the treatment under zoning law of single family residences versus multifamily residences, and how that has resulted in this thing called the missing middle housing, right? Why is it in fact missing, and other effects of this modern and historical project of zoning.
Just so you know, Sarah, we're seeing slide 11.
You are.
Your slideshow here.
Let me fix it. Thank you for letting me know that.
Yeah, and if you're able to hit play, I know it's helpful to have something full screen if possible.
Yeah. It's actually playing on my computer, but I can fix it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, that's great.
Wonderful. Okay, so I was just kind of going over that roadmap, and here it is on the screen. Thank you for letting me know that. So one thing I want to step back, I don't know if you as a group have already talked about what zoning means. I'm going to give you the most basic definition of zoning. I'm cutting out all of the detail here. So what is zoning? Zoning is really the division of a local government or a municipality, such as the city of Eugene, into districts, which also could be called zones, thus the word zoning, and the assignment of permitted uses to each district. And of course, there's a lot more detail there, but this is actually a picture of a zoning map from the 1920s, which was a map that was the zoning in this particular place was at issue in the first U.S. Supreme Court that looked at the validity of zoning. But so dividing up into zones and assigning permitted uses to those zones, right? And really principal permitted uses, such as residential versus industrial versus commercial. So one of the things though about zoning that I think some people know, but a lot of people don't know, is that zoning has this express racial segregationist history. And when I say that, I'm not reading between the lines to say that it was expressly segregationist, but it in fact was used by people, around the turn of the last century and into, the 1920s. It was used to segregate the races, and the zones actually expressly said that, so the permit, instead of permitted land uses, there were permitted people, right, within zones. And eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional in a case called Buchanan. And many places continued to have express racial segregation zoning even after Buchanan. But when they did so after Buchanan, it was illegal. But others actually used low density residential zoning as a Buchanan workaround, meaning they recognized that by having R1 or low density residential zoning, which is single family residential zoning, that because it was more expensive and other attributes that I'll talk about in a moment, that the same effect of racial segregation was achieved through low density zoning that was achieved previously through express racial zoning. And there's historical record to show that this was, in fact, being done. And it was also coupled, though, with other private sector tools to achieve the same effects, such as, for example, things called racially restrictive covenants that were put into the deed of the house itself. So you may have purchased a house or know someone who's purchased a house that has a deed restriction in it. Like I actually just moved to Eugene a year ago. I'm from Oregon, but I had been first in New York and then in Arkansas teaching, and now finally, happily, I'm back home. And so I moved into this house that I was fortunate enough to buy, and it has a deed restriction on it. I cannot build over 25 feet because someone lives uphill from me, and they have the right to see over my house, and that right is in my deed. I would have to negotiate with them to remove it. So there were in the deeds themselves covenants that said you couldn't sell your house or purchase this house if you were Black or Asian or other target racial groups. So one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize, and a lot of people know about redlining and some of this kind of racist history within real estate transaction and real estate deals. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is how involved the federal government was in these programs. So the federal government had mortgage programs that promoted homeownership for white families and created barriers to homeownership for families of color. And again, when I say this, this isn't reading between the lines. It was these goals were clearly spelled out within the programs. And I'll just highlight a couple for you. So 2 programs under the New Deal actually helped middle-class families buy and retain their ownership interest in single-family houses. One helped families who are at risk of foreclosure retain their house, and others helped families become first-time home buyers. And through the creation of what we actually see now as kind of modern mortgage instruments that allowed people who weren't ultra wealthy to use mortgages. Both of those programs were expressly only available to white families. And there were federal underwriting policies that classified Black families or Black buyers as poor risks, and which made them ineligible for the loans. And they favored mortgages for houses in areas where white residents were separated from Black residents. And I really want to highlight this actually, right? Where white residents were separated from Black residents by natural or artificial barriers. And then they classified mortgage lending in neighborhoods with integrated schools also as risky. And the reason why I'm highlighting this point about the barriers is that this history of redlining and of these whites only mortgage and refinance programs was tied into the history of land use. You might notice sometimes that higher density multifamily neighborhoods are often separated from lower density single family neighborhoods by physical barriers like freeways or railroad tracks, or even just some kind of wall in some cities. So one of the things that has been researched and that I've looked at in my research is how old redlining maps, which were maps that were created in the 1930s and later, that categorized neighborhoods as hazardous if they had people of color in them, how those old redlining maps line up with current zoning maps. And what you see many times is that neighborhoods that were categorized as hazardous for lending purposes, in the 1930s and 1940s, 50s, that those same neighborhoods are now the neighborhoods where multifamily housing is allowed. And the neighborhoods that were categorized as being good risks for mortgages, and therefore where mortgages were available, which at the time only could achieve that status if they had only white people in them, are still to this day the neighborhoods that are zoned for single family residential.
Just so you know, you're at about 10 minutes. So if you could wrap up in a minute or two, that would be wonderful.
Yes, and let's see, this slide is kind of hard to see. Well, okay, well, I'm going to get to this one point that I think is quite important. So, so one of the things that zoning law does, and I apologize that the slide is messy and hard to see. One of the things that zoning law does is it attempts to cluster together uses that are considered to be compatible. You might have a residential neighborhood, but you also within that residential neighborhood, you can have some other compatible uses, a church, a small store, things like that. And they attempt to keep out incompatible uses. And one thing that has happened since the early inception of zoning law is that multifamily residential uses were considered to be incompatible with single family uses, and multifamily residential uses were considered to be compatible with other nuisance uses or other undesirable uses, such as industrial uses, adult kind of businesses that you would think you wouldn't want around children. And for me, I always look at that and I think, well, wait a minute, multifamily residences are places where people live with children. I mean, that's how I grew up in a multifamily residence. And, so I wanted to just highlight this early zoning history that says that came from the US Supreme Court in that first case that approved of zoning as a practice in the United States. It equated multifamily residences with parasites and with a nuisance when they're in a residential neighborhood, as if the multifamily residence wasn't itself, something that was a residence, and that the people in them didn't desire or need to live in residential neighborhoods. I'm going to skip this quote. So one of the things we talk about when we talk about middle housing is, and you may have heard this term before, is that we talk about the missing middle. So as a result of all these policies and zoning practices, what happened is that middle housing, which is housing of a scale that's greater, larger, slightly more dense, sometimes such as in a duplex or triplex, than a single family house, but smaller and less dense than high-rise apartments, middle housing disappeared. It was deemed to be one of those incompatible nuisance kind of parasite uses that was, that over time really kind of disappeared from the residential neighborhoods. And the effect of that is that, in places like Oregon, where housing demand is high, residential homes in single family neighborhoods increased in value, and those property values were pushed up. What that meant was that not only were there higher property values for owners, but there were higher rents for tenants. This tended to increase homeowner wealth for people who lived in the single family residential areas, while at the same time reducing real rental incomes because of that inflated rental price, and really exacerbated wealth gaps. And also, the housing demand doesn't disappear, so it shifts out to the urban fringe, which I'm not going to talk about negative effects of that. But the legislature, in passing House Bill 2001, recognized many of these negative effects of having what really essentially with single family zoning is a form of restrictive or exclusionary zoning, a definition of compatible land uses that excludes multifamily uses, and it excludes those multifamily uses. I'm going to skip this slide. Even when, if you look at these images, which are images of various middle housing in projects throughout the United States, those uses may not be incompatible at all with the concept of a neighborhood. And so it's true, and I'm wrapping up, this is my last slide, I promise. It's true, I think, as we've already heard today, that there there can be a lot of pressure, not in my neighborhood, not in my backyard, to keep neighborhoods, the way that they are out of fear about other, what it would mean to change. And, but I think that the legislature recognized that local governments are subject to that kind of pressure that comes from those fears, that need to respond to not just the true facts, but the, strong perceptions of, of citizens, and also of the citizens who speak most loudly, right? And so with the passage of House Bill 2001, what we saw is the legislature saying, Oregon is going to require that in single-family residential zones, the local government has to at least permit middle housing. And I can just stop there. That's actually my last point.
I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So thank you so much, Sarah. Excellent. So let's, and Sarah, yeah, I hope you will get questions at the end here. So if there's anything else you wanted to say, we'll save it for then. And let's move on to Renee Clough. So Renee is a project manager with Branch Engineering. And like the others, I'll let you say anything else about your background that you think would be important for the panel to know. And we'll try to wrap this up in just 10 minutes so that I know we've had a lot of questions for previous presenters, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. So I'll give you a 10-minute warning.
Thank you for having me today. I appreciate it. And just to check real quick, can you, I have two screens here and I'm not sure I shared the right one. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, we can.
So my name is Renee Clough. I'm a licensed engineer, a licensed land surveyor, and a certified planner. So kind of a jack of all trades. I work as a project manager at Branch Engineering. In that role, I prepare a lot of development applications for a variety of project types, a variety of client types. Among those projects are residential projects. And so what I would like to talk to you today about is the current permitting processes around different types of residential, and just some personal observations that I've made that kind of pertain to and relate to the housing shortage situation. So starting with the current processes, there are two avenues to developing a project. One is you go through a planning action plus a building permit, and the other is you just go straight off to the building permit process. Planning applications are typically required for things like a land division or a conditional use permit, which conditional use permits are a process for when you have potentially incompatible uses or uses that are perceived to be incompatible. And there's also site plan review. Eugene doesn't use site plan review quite as heavily as some other jurisdictions in the area. But you do see site plan review crop up occasionally in Eugene, primarily in the South Hills area. So there's a lot of variety in the planning application processes, depending on the project specifics, which planning action you're specifically going through. But there are some generalities that are true to all of them. They all have a tentative application process where you present the concept to the city and interact with the city to determine and confirm that you meet code, followed by a final process where you prepare that documentation. They pretty much all have what's called a neighborhood applicant meeting, which is where you, as the design team, take the project and have a meeting with the neighbors, the people surrounding, and receive their input and thoughts back. Planning applications always have the potential for appeal. In theory, appeals are based on, I don't agree, I think they don't meet this code item. However, I have experienced what's referred to as spite appeals on some of my projects. And those neighbors looked me right in the eye and said, my whole reason for filing this appeal is I don't want this project to happen and I want to drag it out and make it cost as much as I can. And planning applications also, for the most part, have discretion where the requirements include words along the lines of as much as possible. So there's always some level of uncertainty when you're preparing those applications of, well, I think it's as much as possible, but is staff going to think it's the same thing as me? Planning applications, the timeline varies widely on them, but and that depends generally a lot on which type of application you're doing. But generally, they go anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. I'm currently working on one, though, that has been going on for 4 years. And the cost also varies quite a bit based on what type of application you're doing. But even the cheapest one is usually about $25,000, and then it goes up to hundreds of thousands quite easily from there. And that's just for the consultant design team. That doesn't include things like any kind of appeal that they have to defend against or city application fees. So planning applications definitely are quite an undertaking to go through. So the other path is being able to go straight to a building permit. I believe I've heard of one building permit that was appealed in Eugene, but really basically building permits, there isn't a risk of appeal. They have a significantly shorter timeline. From the time you submit to the time you have your permit in hand is generally 3 months, maybe at the most. So they happen a lot faster, certainly not 4 years like I've been experiencing on that planning application. They have a much lower cost, both for the design of it and also the permitting processes. And there's the standards that you meet when you go straight to building permit. There's no discretion. So every test that you have to meet is a yes or no. Do you have your parking ratio? Yes, you do. No, you don't. So as a design team, you know what the city's answer is going to be when you turn that application in. And that is part of why that timeline goes so much faster. For a developer, being able to go straight to building permit is a very big deal. Like that is something they really want and desire because of all those comparisons we just made. I have seen developers who said, I would really like to have another 4 apartment units in this building, but that would tip me over into a planning application. So I'm not going to have those dwelling units because I really want to stick in this process that goes with building permit. I mean, I've definitely seen them give up things that they really wanted because of that cost benefit between a planning application and a building permit. So now kind of diverging into some observations that I have made over the years pertaining to just kind of the whole environment that is created where we're at today with housing prices, missing middle. Some of these aren't necessarily related entirely to each other. They just have that kind of common theme to them. I've tried to organize things to be at least flow a little bit. So it probably is fairly obvious to everybody that housing costs go up when development costs go up. And if you put more in, you need to get more back. So if you're having to divide a property to make more lots to build on, like, if you have one lot and you can put only one house on that, but you have a big yard, you're going to have to go through that land division planning application process to be able to build on that yard. Whereas if you can avoid that planning application and build on that yard without having to have it, your costs are going to be lower, which means you can sell it for lower, you can rent it for lower. And from a developer's perspective, costs aren't necessarily just the direct costs of the checks they write to people, it's also an indirect cost. The longer time something takes, the more they need to be able to get back because they're paying money out that whole time. And that's money they could have been investing in some other opportunity where they were getting money back faster. And so the longer something goes, the more they need to be compensated for that lost opportunity. And also another fairly basic economic concept is that costs go up when supply goes down. And this is, I think Chris touched a little bit on this, but several years ago during the Envision Eugene process, Eugene made the decision, for a number of reasons that aren't really relevant here, but Eugene made the decision to not expand the urban growth boundary, which is essentially that line that was drawn around the city that said, city development is going to happen in here. Outside of this, we really want to try hard for that to be forest and farms and not city things. So that's kind of trying to push the residential things into a very finite boundary. And so the only way you're going to keep your supply up is to increase your density. And so that comes around to what things make it difficult to increase density. I tend to think of them as complicators for density. Stormwater is one of those. Federal regulations and local regulations require some pretty extensive stormwater facilities on projects, both to treat the stormwater before it leaves the site so that it goes off the site clean without contamination, and also to slow the stormwater so that it goes out over time rather than just in a big rush. But the way those standards are written, those facilities take up a large amount of space. So setting that space aside is putting aside area that you could have put housing, but now you can't because you have a stormwater facility there. Wetlands, again, a very similar kind of situation where there are some local regulations surrounding wetlands and protecting them, but a lot of those regulations are at the federal level, and they really push towards preserving the wetlands exactly in their current location, not touching them, which I'm not complaining about that. I think there are certainly plenty of benefits to that. But the result is, again, you've got this area set aside that you're not putting housing into. That is, the developer paid to buy it, but now they can't put something on it to get their money back. So that cost gets transferred to the ones they can build.
And you were at
parking is another complication for density. The more parking stalls or area spaces you need for a dwelling, the more land area gets consumed by those cars. So you get this kind of balancing act of, well, we want this many units, but that's this much parking, and we can't fit them both on the site. So let's drop the units, which drops the parking. Oh, now they fit. So if you can do things that decrease the need for parking, that frees up that area to have more dwelling units, but then also at the same time, our culture wants parking. So it's a very fine balance and can be difficult to find.
Renee, you were at 10 minutes.
Okay.
So if you could wrap up in a minute, that would be amazing.
I think I can do that. So trees are another one where there is a big push in Eugene to preserve the existing trees and retain current trees that are there, but they have root systems that then have to be protected, which consumes a very large amount of space on the site. And so often if you can remove those existing trees and plant back replacement trees, you can make a much more efficient use of your site space and therefore be at a higher density. Open space is, it's great to be able to go outside and sit on your lawn or throw a ball for the dog, but there again, it's space that you're not building that those housing units in. And neighbors, they trying to find a way to say this that I don't accidentally poke somebody's buttons, but neighbors can often be density complicators in that they find change to be very frightening, which is part of why we experience those spite appeals. And I don't blame them. Change is frightening for me too. But one of the compromises they often request and want is a lower density project. They feel that if they have to have neighbors, they want fewer neighbors. And so that we're often trying to find that balance with the neighbors as well. And so that's all. Thanks for listening and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have some time now for questions for all three of our presenters. And if you wouldn't mind unsharing, oh, there you go, perfect. Okay, so just like the last couple sessions, we're doing, we're still in our information gathering stage now. So questions that kind of help us wrap our minds around the terminology, the context, the basics of this issue. For Chris Pryor, Sarah Adams Schoen, and Renee Clough, just start raising your hands and I'll call on folks. I see Sam, go ahead.
I just want to say really quickly, Sarah Adams Schoen, I love that you put captions on your slideshow. That was super accessible and just definitely made it a lot easier to follow along with. Wasn't a question, just a compliment.
Thanks for that comment, Sam. Other questions for any of our three presenters today? I know that was a lot of information.
I kind of have a question, but I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. Sorry about that. My question is for Renee. So kind of what I'm gathering from your presentation is that if everybody can make it so that the planning application period isn't necessarily, so like if everybody can make it so that we all have an understanding of how the housing in Eugene's going to go, then they can kind of like go skip the planning part and go right to the review or the application part, so that like the more clear it is, the less input, you know what I mean? Like there's less room to not argue, but like you already know what can go in this lot. There's not as much planning and like figuring. So is that what we're trying to do, is make it as crystal clear so that the planning application process isn't so not arbitrary, but like muddy? Is that what we're trying to do, is make it super clear so that everybody knows, and then we can kind of bypass that everybody weighing in, because we've already weighed in and decided? Is that kind of like what we're trying to do then?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head really well there, that if a code item can be written so that, things like setbacks are a really good example. Your minimum setback is 5 feet from the property line. That's really clear and straightforward, versus your setback must be such that you don't cause undue impact to your neighbor. That's a little drastic, but but yeah, that what you were saying is exactly what I was trying to get across.
And I see we have Donovan's hand as well here, but since we don't have a ton of hands, I'm going to also throw that to Sarah has offered to make another comment on that question.
Yeah, I also, with respect to that question and to what Renee was talking about, which I think is really gets in a way also to the heart of what House Bill 2001 was doing, is by requiring middle housing to be permitted uses in single family zones, then that planning process and that approval process is shortened. So right now, and Renee was touching on this, if you want to, I'll just use myself, if my house is bigger than I need and it has some separate areas in it, which it actually does, and I also have a huge garage that I'm not using, if I want to, put, make my garage into a duplex, or even, have 3 residences on my lot, because it's actually, my home is big enough to accommodate that. Right now, I would have to go through a lengthy planning process of seeking approvals, because it's not a permitted as of right use. And what HB 2001 is doing is saying, the legislature was saying to cities, you have to permit these uses, and that makes the projects less expensive and less time consuming, because by permitting them as of right uses, you don't have to go through all of the lengthy approvals. I mean, you still have to get building permits and some approvals, but it cuts that cost.
One thing I would also add from the elected official standpoint is the more clear you are, the less the elected officials have the ability to monkey around with the process. House Bill 1051 is a great example of that, which was an earlier version where they said you have to allow certain types of housing, but it was a 1-paragraph ruling that was so vague that it was very easy for us as elected officials to say, I don't understand what this one paragraph ruling means, therefore I can ignore it. And so when you lack clarity, you're actually providing an opportunity for people to not implement. And so you really do need as much clarity as you can, which is what this long rulemaking process can do for you. At the same time, if you require so specifically in every single instance, you wind up with a setback has to be so much. And then you wind up with a capstone development on 13th because the rule said you had to have this kind of setback. And it would have been nice if capstone had been this further back from 13th Street, but the rule said it had to be here. And the rule was very clear. And so you didn't get a good outcome because the rule applied in every single situation sometimes produces a bad outcome. So it becomes a balancing act. I'm all for clarity. Clarity is a great way to allow people to not avoid, but it can also occasionally be applied poorly. The Applebee's on West 11th is another good example. How do you put bus transit down West 11th when you have an Applebee's right up against the street because the code was very clear and required it?
Thanks, everybody. So I see we have several hands, and just in the interest of getting as many people able to ask questions as possible, I'm going to go a little bit out of order. So if you've had a chance to ask a question to previous presenters, you'll just be at the bottom of the list, and I hope we'll get to you. But I know Francisco had a question last time, so let's go to Francisco.
Hi, thank you. Well, it was a question for Chris, and he explained it. The last comment that he made is the 2001. Next, I think it's going to take effect, or it has to be applied in 2022, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so are these rules will apply to all the neighborhoods in the city or just some?
There, it will apply. With regard to duplexes, it will apply to every single R1 residential lot. With regard to the other types of housing, it will apply to all R1 areas, and that was intended to allow a certain level of flexibility. But it does apply in all R1 areas. Now, one complication which the state can't do anything about is if you are in a neighborhood that has CC&Rs, covenants and restrictions. House Bill 2001 does not supersede your neighborhood CC&Rs. So if you have CC&Rs, that creates an automatic conflict. But where those don't exist, particularly in older neighborhoods, it will go into effect.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I see that there's one question in the chat here that got an answer. So I'm going to go to one other person and then ask this question to be read from the chat so everybody can hear it. But let's go to Robert now.
Yes, my question is more to our speakers in general, but probably to Renee in general. The first, it's the two questions, a point of curiosity. The first is there such a thing as an architectural standard from an aesthetic point of view for Eugene, particular Oregon in general? And the second question is, could you outline the current rules or barriers to ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and the conversions of one family to, say, a multifamily unit as they exist today?
There are currently no code or zoning restrictions that are based on an aesthetic. And that was actually very intentional. The city doesn't want to become involved in deciding what's pretty and what's not pretty. But we do very rigorously, and we just actually improved our requirements with regard to health and safety. So within health and safety or nuisance, there is a certain level of aesthetic enforcement we can have. No destroyed houses, no blue tarps on top of roofs. But other than that, we can't say that house is pretty or that house is ugly. And then with regard to your second question about ADUs, we've had a lot of conversation about ADUs. We're required to allow ADUs now, which got a lot of resistance from the folks that the other two presenters were talking about, who didn't want, that kind of housing, but we're now going to allow it. But it's going to be subject to a number of additional code requirements, but they can't be so restrictive as to make it impossible to build. In other words, the goal is not, we'll allow it, but we'll make it so hard that nobody can actually do it. That's what we're working through right now, is how we can make it possible to do within all of those areas. So yes, we're working on that right now to make it more possible to have ADUs.
Thank you.
I can respond to a little bit to that question. Although I'll be quick because I can see there's a couple of more hands. One thing though that I thought might be helpful in terms of aesthetics, and I really, I applaud the city of Eugene also for not, for not attempting to dictate, what's pretty or not. That tends to be, there tends to be a lot of problems with that, as Chris mentioned. But there's another aspect to aesthetics, and that is that things that are compatible in terms of form, and so that is regulated, not as in pretty or not pretty, but you see it with respect to height requirements, and the idea that this middle high rise over here isn't compatible in terms of form to this small scale residential neighborhood. And one of the things that the middle housing legislation does is it says that these smaller scales of middle housing right here are compatible in terms of form with single family residential neighborhoods. So that does get at aesthetics to an extent. And also the city is still able to have things like setbacks that require yards, for example. So that just also gets to that question, I think, of aesthetics. And of course, under Oregon law, I shouldn't say of course, because it seems to suggest everyone should actually know this, and that's just not true. But under Oregon law, if you're in a single family residential zone and you are currently permitted to put an ADU on your lot. And so that already exists.
And Sarah, thank you so much. We have a pretty hard stop on timing. I'm so sorry to cut you off again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your responses. And I want to make sure that we get a little bit of time to reflect on all this information. So I'm just going to direct folks. There's just one question and an answer in the chat that everybody can read. And thank you so much to our speakers today. So we're going to move into a little bit of time to just help everybody digest this information that we've just been presented with. Before we go on a break, we're going to take just a couple of minutes here to quietly write down some big takeaways from today. So any notes you want to capture, things you've just learned, and then we won't be using chat very much since it's not very public, but I'd like to invite you all for the sake of our task committee that's kind of collecting outside information to put one thing in the chat that you've learned today, and that information will become public through the work of the task committee that then you'll be contributing notes to their work. So just take a couple of minutes, write something down, share it in the chat. And then once you've done that, you're free to go on break at 10:55. Okay, and we'll put up a screen to remind you of that. But please first, just take a couple minutes, and thank you again to our presenters from today. Oh.
Sorry, I'm late. I didn't see the message and I wasn't expecting one this early.
Oh, that's okay, Cheryl. We'll have somebody get in touch with you. We're just about to go on a break, so we'll see you back for our next activity at 11:10.
11:10. Okay, I will definitely be there. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Lynn, we are now seeing the flip chart.
Thank you. Well, you'll see that in it's public information, but not yet.
No
Thank you.
secrets. All right. So thank you to folks who are starting to put your learnings in the chat here. So once you've reflected for a couple minutes, feel free to share those with everybody, and we'll save the chat and make sure the task committee has that information. If you want to keep sharing throughout the break, feel free, but no pressure. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Nice to see you again. Hope that was a restorative break. So the next part of this day is going to be something a little bit different. Your first chance to sort of make some decisions, and I want to emphasize it's only the first chance. So this is going to be you're going to be working with a menu that's been created by the steering committee of, I think, 57 different names of potential experts and stakeholders who could present to you next week that you can choose from. Now, a few things to mention. One, this won't be the last time we do this. We'll come back to this on Tuesday and you'll have another chance. You'll in fact be receiving this menu in the mail in paper form. So don't worry if you're having trouble seeing it on screen today. This is just a first pass just to get a few names so that Sarah Giles, who's doing the expert liaison work, can go and start making some calls to people to schedule them. But you'll come back and do the majority of this work with the paper in hand on Tuesday. So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing is, if you see somebody or a group of people that's sort of unrepresented on this list, or you have a suggestion to make, sort of like independent research, every panelist has the option to add somebody, up to one person. Now you don't have to, there's a lot of people on the list, and hopefully the steering committee did a good job and covered lots of bases. But if you see something, you're like, ooh, there's something missing here, then email me, and I'll make this mention again at the end of the day, and we will include it on the list, maybe not in time to print and mail it, but include it as an option later. I think that's what I need to say there. Oh, I need to explain what's actually going to happen here. So the way that we're going to do this, because that's a lot of names, and they're in different categories. The steering committee's put them in different categories, and they've also ranked them or prioritized them according to how many folks on the steering committee thought that each person on the list was sort of a great option. Recommendations. That's the word I want. So within each category, they're listed by how many folks recommended them. But I would offer this caution that doesn't necessarily mean that the person at the top of the list always needs to be the one chosen, because it may be important when you look at sort of all the experts gathered, especially as we're looking at sort of all the folks that we've heard from and that you're going to hear from next week, to consider, oh, there may be some minority voices here that we're leaving out. So there'll be an option for that next week to sort of look at that in totality. But for the moment, you'll each be in small groups looking at a screen of, well, about 1/5 of the total number of suggested speakers. And your small group moderator can read through names if somebody's having a hard time seeing it on screen. And then your first task in that first group will be to narrow that list down to about 5. So your moderators will tell you a little bit more, but you'll take a while to sort of look at the list, come up with, sort of write down an idea, each person, of what might be your recommendation, and then you'll chat about it for a while. Your group will come up with 5 to pass on to the next group, and then you'll sort of virtually trade papers. And the next group will come along, see those 5 recommendations, and think about them, talk about them, and whittle them down to about 2. Now, and then we'll do that again, and the third group will whittle that down to 1. And the reason why we're doing that this time is just so we can get 5 experts from the 5 different groups this time, and spread across different categories, so that we can start scheduling a few people. But there'll be lots more opportunities to select more folks when we come back on Tuesday. All right, small group moderator is going to answer more questions. Let's go into small groups.